The small town of Willow Creek was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names. Life here moved at a slow, predictable pace, with days blending into one another like the soft hum of crickets on summer nights. It wasn't the kind of place where strange things happened, until that day at Eleanor Harper's funeral. Eleanor had been a beloved figure in Willow Creek. She was the kind of person who always greeted you with a warm smile, whether it was at the grocery store or during Sunday morning church services. A retired school teacher, she spent her free time tending to her garden, which overflowed with colorful flowers and herbs. Her 2 kids were all grown up now, but they still talked about how their mom used to bake cookies for them after school. Everyone thought they'd known Eleanor inside out, that is, until the moment her funeral took an unexpected turn. On the morning of the service, the weather matched the somber mood. The sky was overcast and a light drizzle dampened the streets. Friends, neighbors, and former students filed into the church, filling every pew. The air smelled faintly of lilies, the flowers chosen by her family because they were her favorite. As the pastor spoke, his voice echoed through the quiet room, heavy with emotion. People dabbed at their eyes with tissues, sharing stories about how Eleanor had touched their lives. When the service ended, the casket was opened for a final viewing. That's when it happened. Just as someone leaned in to say goodbye, a movement caught their eye. At first, no one could believe what they were seeing. A snake, sleek and black, slithering out from beneath the folds of Eleanor's dress. It wasn't big, but its sudden appearance sent shockwaves through the crowd. Gasps erupted, followed by frantic whispers. Some people recoiled, while others froze in disbelief. Reverend Thompson, pale-faced and visibly shaken, stepped forward. He reached out hesitantly, ready to remove the snake. But before he could act, something even stranger occurred. Instead of retreating or showing aggression, the snake curled itself gently around Eleanor's hand. It didn't move after that. It just stayed there, as if guarding her body. For a moment, the entire room fell silent, save for the sound of rain tapping against the windows. People began murmuring among themselves, trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. "It's a bad omen," muttered one elderly woman, clutching her rosary beads. Another man shook his head firmly. "No, this has to mean something else. Maybe it's, I don't know, some kind of sign?" No one could agree on what to do next. Meanwhile, Eleanor's daughter stood frozen near the front row, tears streaming down her face. Through choked sobs, she managed to say, "Mom always loved animals, even snakes." Her words seemed to break the tension slightly, though. Fear still lingered in the room. The pastor tried to regain control of the situation, urging everyone to remain calm. But deep down, no one felt truly at ease. What did this mean? Was it coincidence, or was there something more going on? As the casket was closed again and preparations continued for the burial, the image of that snake stayed etched in everyone's minds. Little did they know, this was only the beginning of a story that would leave the entire town questioning everything they thought they understood about life and death. The burial procession moved slowly through the rain-soaked streets of Willow Creek. The mourners huddled under dark umbrellas. No one spoke much. The sight of that snake at the funeral had left everyone unsettled. By the time they reached the cemetery, the drizzle had turned into a steady downpour, soaking shoes and dampening spirits even further. The casket was lowered into the ground, and as the first shovelful of dirt hit the wooden lid, an eerie sound filled the air. A low hum, soft but unmistakable. It wasn't the wind or the rustling of leaves. This was something different, something alive. At first, people thought it might be their imaginations playing tricks on them. But then the sound grew louder, almost melodic, like distant singing. Some crossed themselves instinctively, while others clutched their coats tighter around them. One older man muttered, "This isn't natural," his voice barely audible over the rain. A woman beside him whispered back, "Do you think it's her?" Nobody dared to answer. They just stood there, frozen, watching as the grave was filled in silence. When the service finally ended, most of the mourners hurried away, eager to escape the cold and the strange atmosphere, but a few lingered, staring at the freshly dug earth. Among them was Eleanor's daughter, who knelt by the grave despite the mud soaking her dress. She placed a small bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked from her mother's garden on the mound of dirt. As she stood up, she swore she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. Turning quickly, she caught a glimpse of something black disappearing into the grass. Her heart raced, but when she called out, no one else seemed to notice. Over the following days, talk of the funeral dominated every conversation in Willow Creek. The snake, the humming noise. It was all anyone could think about. Some dismissed it as nonsense, blaming the rain for creating odd acoustics or suggesting the snake had simply wandered into the church by accident. Others weren't so quick to brush it off. Rumors began to spread, growing wilder with each retelling. One elderly neighbor claimed snakes were symbols of transformation in old folklore. Another insisted the creature must have been sent to guide Eleanor's soul to the afterlife. Whatever the truth was, the town couldn't stop talking about it. For Eleanor's family, the events of the funeral weighed heavily. Her husband spent hours sitting alone in his study, staring blankly at old photos of her. He didn't say much, but it was clear he was struggling to make sense of everything. Their daughter, however, felt drawn to the mystery. She started noticing little things that others missed, like how birds would gather in unusually large numbers near the cemetery, chirping loudly at dawn and dusk, or how flowers seemed to bloom faster than usual around Eleanor's grave, bursting into vibrant colors despite the gloomy weather. These details gnawed at her curiosity. What did it all mean? Was her mother trying to tell them something? One evening, unable to shake the feeling that there was more to uncover, she decided to visit the local library, tucked away in a corner. Surrounded by dusty books and flickering fluorescent lights, she began searching for answers. She flipped through volumes on snakes, mythology, and spiritual symbols, hoping to find a clue. Hours passed before she stumbled upon an ancient legend about a serpent that served as a bridge between worlds. According to the tale, such creatures appeared during moments of great transition, guiding souls to their next journey. Reading those words sent a shiver down her spine. Could this be connected to what happened at her mother's funeral? Determined to share her discovery, she rushed home and told her father about the legend. At first, he dismissed it as fanciful thinking, shaking his head and saying, "It's just a story, sweetheart." But when she described the humming sound, the dreams people were having, and the unnatural growth of flowers near the grave, even he couldn't deny that something unusual was going on. Reluctantly, he agreed to accompany her to the cemetery late at night, hoping to put an end to the mystery, or perhaps find some closure. As they prepared to leave, the daughter felt a mix of fear and excitement bubbling inside her. What would they find at the grave? Would they hear the humming again? And what about the snake? Would it reappear? Despite her nerves, she couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward the cemetery, as if her mother's spirit was calling out to her. Whatever awaited them, she knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The night was colder than either of them had expected. A sharp wind cut through the darkness, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and pine needles. Father and daughter walked side by side, their footsteps crunching softly against the gravel path that led to the cemetery. Neither spoke much. The weight of what they were about to do hung heavily between them. The daughter clutched a lantern in one hand, its feeble light casting long, flickering shadows on the ground. Her father carried nothing but his unease, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. When they reached the cemetery gates, the daughter hesitated for a moment. She glanced at her father, searching for reassurance, but his face was unreadable in the dim light. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the gate open, the hinges groaning loudly in protest. The sound seemed to echo endlessly in the stillness, making both of them flinch. They stepped inside, the rows of headstones looming like silent sentinels around them. The air felt heavier here, charged with an energy neither could quite explain. They made their way to Eleanor's grave, guided by the faint glow of the lantern. As they approached, something caught the daughter's eye. Fresh tracks in the soil, long and sinuous, unmistakably left by a snake. Her heart skipped a beat. Do you see that? She whispered, pointing at the marks. Her father squinted, then nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. For a moment they just stood there, staring at the evidence before them. It was real. Whatever had happened at the funeral wasn't over yet. Suddenly, the same haunting melody they'd heard weeks ago filled the air. This time, though, it was louder, clearer, almost hypnotic. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, wrapping itself around them like a blanket. The daughter felt goosebumps rise on her arms, but strangely, she wasn't afraid. Instead, she felt calm, like the music was soothing her soul rather than unsettling it. Her father, however, looked visibly shaken. He muttered something under his breath, maybe a prayer or just a string of words meant to steady himself. Then, out of the shadows, it appeared, the black snake, gliding silently toward them. Its movements were graceful, deliberate, as if it knew exactly where it was going. The daughter froze, her breath catching in her throat. But instead of fear, she felt an overwhelming sense of recognition, as if she'd seen this creature before, not in real life, but in dreams. The snake stopped inches away from her feet, raised its head slightly, and gazed directly into her eyes. In that moment, everything changed. Time seemed to slow down, and the world around her faded away. All she could focus on was the snake, and the flood of emotions washing over her. It wasn't fear or confusion she felt now. It was clarity. She understood without a doubt that this wasn't just any ordinary animal. It was a messenger, a symbol of her mother's enduring presence. Somehow, impossibly, Eleanor was reaching out to her family through this creature. Her father let out a shaky breath, breaking the spell. What is it doing?" he asked, his voice trembling. The daughter didn't answer right away. She knelt down slowly, setting the lantern aside. With trembling hands, she reached out, not to touch the snake, but to show it she wasn't afraid. The snake didn't move, didn't react. It simply stayed there, watching her with unblinking eyes. After what felt like an eternity, it turned and began slithering back toward the grave, leaving behind another set of tracks in the dirt. As it disappeared into the shadows, the humming stopped abruptly, plunging the cemetery back into silence. The daughter sat back on her heels, her mind racing. She wanted to follow the snake, to ask it questions, to beg it for answers. But she knew better. Whatever message it carried, whatever connection it represented, it wasn't meant to be forced or rushed. Instead, she closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." When she opened them again, her father was looking at her, his expression a mix of awe and disbelief. Neither of them said much on the walk home. Words felt inadequate, unable to capture the enormity of what they'd experienced. But as they climbed into bed that night, the daughter couldn't help but feel a sense of peace she hadn't known since her mother's passing. The snake hadn't brought fear, it had brought comfort. And though she didn't fully understand why or how, she knew one thing for certain: her mother's love hadn't ended with her death. If anything, it had taken on a new form, one that defied explanation but left no room for doubt. Word of their midnight visit spread quickly through Willow Creek. Some dismissed it as nonsense, while others listened intently, hanging on to every word. Whether people believed or not, one thing was undeniable. Eleanor Harper's story had become something more than just a tale of loss. It was a reminder that even in death, love finds a way to speak, if only we're willing to listen. By the next morning, news of the midnight encounter had traveled fast through Willow Creek. Word of mouth was like wildfire in a small town, and this story was too strange and too compelling not to share. People gathered in coffee shops, grocery store aisles, and front porches, swapping details they'd heard about the snake, the humming sound, and the daughter's visit to the cemetery. Some recounted the events with wide-eyed wonder, while others added their own embellishments, turning the tale into something almost mythical. One neighbor claimed the snake had glowing eyes, while another swore it spoke in a voice only the daughter could hear. The truth, as always, got muddled in the retelling, but one thing remained clear. Eleanor Harper's grave had become more than just a resting place. It was now a site of mystery, curiosity, and, for some, hope. The daughter found herself at the center of it all, whether she liked it or not. Strangers approached her on the street asking questions or offering condolences mixed with thinly veiled curiosity. "Did you really see it?" one woman asked, clutching her handbag nervously. "What did it feel like?" Another man who ran the local hardware store told her he'd been having vivid dreams about Eleanor ever since the funeral. In his dream, she stood in a sunlit field, smiling warmly, with the same black snake coiled around her shoulders. He described it so vividly that the daughter felt a chill run down her spine. She realized she wasn't the only one being visited by these unexplainable signs. Despite the growing attention, the daughter kept returning to the cemetery. Each visit felt like a conversation she couldn't have anywhere else, a quiet exchange between her grief and the lingering presence of her mother. Sometimes she brought flowers, other times she simply sat by the grave, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. On one such visit, she noticed something new, a cluster of wildflowers blooming near the headstone, their petals an impossible shade of deep purple. They hadn't been there before, and no one else seemed to know where they'd come from. It was as if the earth itself was responding to the energy surrounding the grave. Word of these strange occurrences began drawing visitors from neighboring towns. Curious onlookers would park along the narrow road leading to the cemetery, stepping out of their cars with cameras or notebooks in hand. Some came seeking answers, convinced that Eleanor's story held clues to life after death. Others were drawn by the sheer oddity of it all, eager to witness firsthand the phenomena everyone was talking about. Flowers, candles, and handwritten notes started appearing at the grave, left behind by strangers hoping for guidance or comfort. One note read, "If you can hear us, please send a sign." Another said, "Thank you for reminding me that love never truly leaves." As the weeks went by, the makeshift memorial grew larger and more elaborate. Local kids began calling it the magical grave, whispering stories about how the flowers changed colors overnight, or how birds sang louder here than anywhere else. Adults rolled their eyes at the tales but couldn't deny the unusual activity. Even skeptics admitted there was something different about the spot, a palpable energy that made you pause even if just for a moment. For the daughter, the growing interest brought mixed feelings. On one hand, she was grateful that her mother's memory was touching so many lives. But on the other, she worried the story was becoming less about Eleanor and more about spectacle. She didn't want people to forget the woman behind the legend, the kind teacher, the devoted gardener, the loving parent. So, she decided to take matters into her own hands. One Saturday afternoon, she organized a small gathering at the cemetery. She invited anyone who wanted to come, asking them to bring a photo, a memento, or just a memory of someone they'd lost. Her goal was simple: to honor Eleanor not as a mysterious figure tied to strange events, but as a real person whose life had meaning. To her surprise, dozens of people showed up. They stood in a circle around the grave, sharing stories of loved ones who had passed. A young boy talked about his grandfather who used to teach him how to fish. An elderly woman spoke fondly of her late husband, recalling how he always danced in the kitchen while making breakfast. As each person shared, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt lighter, warmer, as if the weight of collective grief was lifting, even if just for a little while. When it was her turn, the daughter stepped forward, holding back tears. "My mom wasn't perfect," she began, her voice trembling. "But she was kind. She cared deeply about people, animals, nature, all of it. And I think that's why this is happening. Not because of some supernatural force, but because her kindness left ripples. Maybe the snake, the flowers, the humming, it's all just reminders. Reminders that love doesn't disappear when someone dies. It stays with us in ways we don't always understand." Her words struck a chord. People nodded, some wiping away tears, others exchanging knowing glances. For the first time in weeks, the focus shifted back to what truly mattered: Eleanor's legacy of love and connection. And though the mystery of the snake remained unsolved, it no longer felt like the most important part of the story. What mattered was the way it brought people together, forcing them to confront their own losses and memories. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cemetery, the crowd slowly dispersed. The daughter stayed behind, sitting quietly by the grave. She didn't expect the snake to reappear, nor did she need it to. Whatever message it carried had already been delivered. Love endures, not in grand gestures or unexplainable events, but in the quiet moments, the shared stories, the memories we carry forward. And for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. The weeks turned into months, but the story of Eleanor Harper and the mysterious snake never faded from the minds of Willow Creek's residents. If anything, it grew stronger, woven deeper into the fabric of the town's identity. People who had once dismissed the events as mere superstition found themselves drawn back to the cemetery, unable to shake the feeling that something extraordinary was still unfolding. Even those who hadn't known Eleanor personally felt connected to her story, as if her life and death had become a mirror reflecting their own experiences with loss and love. For the daughter, life began to settle into a new rhythm. The initial shock of the funeral and the midnight encounter gave way to a quiet acceptance. She stopped visiting the cemetery every day, though she made sure to go at least once a week, often bringing fresh flowers or simply sitting in silence. Each time she went, she noticed something new, another cluster of wildflowers blooming where none should have grown, or a pair of birds perched on the headstone, chirping melodiously. These small details reassured her that her mother's presence lingered, not in some grand supernatural way, but in the subtle beauty of the world around her. One chilly autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled in the breeze, she arrived at the grave to find an unexpected visitor waiting for her. It was the elderly woman who ran the flower shop at the edge of town, clutching a bundle of dried lavender in one hand and a notebook in the other. "I hope you don't mind me being here," the woman said softly, her voice tinged with nervousness. "I've been meaning to talk to you." The daughter smiled warmly, inviting her to sit. The woman hesitated before beginning her story. Her husband had passed away 5 years earlier, leaving her heartbroken and adrift. Since hearing about Eleanor's grave and the strange happenings surrounding it, she'd started visiting regularly. At first it was just curiosity, but over time she began to feel a sense of peace she hadn't known since her husband's death. "It's like I can hear him again," she confessed, her eyes glistening with tears. "Not literally, of course. But when I'm here, I remember all the good things, the laughter, the little moments we shared. And somehow that makes the pain easier to bear." Her words resonated deeply with the daughter. She realized that Eleanor's story wasn't just about her family anymore. It had become a source of healing for others too. Strangers were finding solace in the same place where she had sought answers, and that realization filled her with both gratitude and responsibility. She decided then and there to do more, to create a space where people could come together, not just to mourn, but to celebrate life and connection. With the help of a few friends and neighbors, she organized what she called Eleanor's Gathering. Held on the first Saturday of every month, it was part memorial, part community event. Participants were encouraged to bring photos, letters, or objects that reminded them of loved ones they'd lost. They would gather near the grave, sharing stories and memories under the shade of the old oak tree. There was no formal structure, no speeches, just honest conversation and mutual support. The first gathering drew a modest crowd, mostly locals who had already been touched by Eleanor's story. But as word spread, more people began showing up. Some from neighboring towns, others traveling from farther away. A young man shared how his sister used to sing him to sleep when they were kids, her voice the only thing that calmed his nightmares. An older gentleman talked about his best friend, who had taught him how to fix cars and always insisted on calling them mechanical puzzles. Each story was unique, yet they all carried the same thread of love and longing. What surprised everyone most was how uplifting these gatherings felt. Yes, there were tears, plenty of them, but there was also laughter, warmth, and a profound sense of unity. For many, it was the first time they'd spoken openly about their grief without fear of judgment or discomfort. Others discovered they weren't alone in their struggles, forming bonds with people who understood exactly what they were going through. By the end of each session, the air seemed lighter, as if the weight of collective sorrow had lifted, even if just slightly. As the months passed, the cemetery transformed into something more than a resting place for the dead. It became a sanctuary, a living tribute to the power of memory and love. People left offerings at Eleanor's grave, handwritten poems, trinkets, and even small stones painted with messages of hope. Someone planted a rose bush nearby, its crimson blooms standing out against the muted tones of fall. Another person strung tiny wind chimes from the branches of the oak tree, their gentle tinkling adding a soothing soundtrack to the gatherings. Even skeptics, who had initially mocked the idea of a magical grave, found themselves softening. One man, a gruff mechanic known for his no-nonsense attitude, attended reluctantly after his teenage son begged him to come. He sat silently at the edge of the group, arms crossed, clearly uncomfortable. But when a woman spoke about losing her son in a car accident, his expression shifted. Later, he approached the daughter and admitted that he'd lost his own brother years ago, but had never allowed himself to grieve properly. This place, it feels different, he said gruffly, avoiding eye contact. Maybe I'll come back next time. The snake, meanwhile, remained elusive. No one saw it again after that night at the cemetery, but its absence didn't diminish the impact it had made. To the daughter, it represented something greater than itself, a symbol of transition, guidance, and enduring love. Whether it was truly a supernatural entity or just a creature caught in an extraordinary moment didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the ripple effect it had created, touching lives far beyond what anyone could have imagined. By the time winter arrived, blanketing Willow Creek in a soft layer of snow, the gatherings had become a cherished tradition. The daughter no longer felt burdened by her grief. Instead, she saw it as a bridge connecting her to others who had walked similar paths. And though she missed her mother dearly, she took comfort in knowing that Eleanor's legacy lived on, not just in the stories people told, but in the way those stories brought them closer to one another. Love, she realized, wasn't confined to a single lifetime. It stretched across boundaries, defying logic and reason, reminding everyone lucky enough to witness it that even in death the ties that bind us remain unbroken. Winter in Willow Creek brought a quiet stillness to the town, the kind that made you want to stay indoors with a warm cup of tea and a good book. But for Eleanor's daughter, the season carried a different kind of significance. It was during these colder months that she noticed something remarkable. People didn't stop coming to the cemetery. Snow blanketed the ground. Icicles hung from tree branches, and yet every Saturday morning, footprints marked the path leading to her mother's grave. Some came alone, wrapped in scarves and gloves, while others arrived in small groups, their breath visible in the frosty air. The gatherings had become more than just a ritual. They were now a lifeline for those who needed it most. One particularly bitter morning, the daughter arrived early, carrying a thermos of hot cocoa she'd prepared the night before. She set it down on a wooden bench near the grave along with a stack of paper cups. As she worked, she noticed an elderly man shuffling toward her, his steps slow but deliberate. His face was weathered, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched a worn leather wallet. She recognized him. He owned the diner downtown, though. She'd never seen him at any of the previous gatherings. "Morning," she greeted him warmly, offering him a cup of cocoa. He accepted it with a nod, his fingers brushing against hers briefly. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, almost hesitantly, he opened the wallet and pulled out a faded photograph. "This is my wife," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The picture showed a smiling woman standing beside a Christmas tree, her eyes crinkled with laughter. "She passed away 3 years ago. I haven't been able to talk about her since." The daughter listened quietly, giving him space to share as much or as little as he wanted. Over the next hour, he told her stories about their life together, their First dance, the way she always burned toast no matter how hard she tried. The time they got lost on a road trip and ended up laughing so hard they cried. By the end of it, tears streamed down his cheeks, but there was also a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you," he whispered, slipping the photo back into his wallet. I think I needed this." Moments like these became common at Eleanor's grave. People came not just to honor the dead, but to reconnect with themselves and each other. A young mother brought her toddler, explaining that the child barely remembered his father, who had died in an accident. Together, they left a toy car. Beside the headstone, the boy chattering happily about how much his dad loved racing games. An older woman shared how she used to bake pies with her late sister, bringing along a slice of apple pie she'd made that week as an offering. Each story added another layer to the tapestry of memories woven around the site, turning it into a living monument of love and resilience. As word spread beyond Willow Creek, visitors began arriving from farther away. One woman traveled over 200 miles after hearing about the gatherings online. She carried a framed painting of her teenage son, who had died unexpectedly the year before. "I don't know why I'm here," she admitted, her voice breaking, "but I felt like I had to come." The daughter hugged her tightly, assuring her that she belonged there as much as anyone else. That day, the woman stayed until sunset, sharing snippets of her son's life, his passion for music, his mischievous grin, the way he always called her Mama, even as he grew older. When she finally left, she promised to return. Not everyone who came sought closure. Some simply needed a place to sit and think, surrounded by the quiet hum of shared humanity. Others found inspiration in the stories they heard, realizing they weren't alone in their struggles. One man, a widower who rarely spoke to anyone, started volunteering to help organize the gatherings. Another woman began writing letters to her deceased brother, leaving them tucked under stones near the grave. Slowly but surely, the cemetery transformed into a space where grief wasn't something to be hidden or feared. It was acknowledged, embraced, and ultimately transcended. Even the skeptics who had once dismissed the snake as a mere coincidence found themselves drawn in. One afternoon, a local journalist showed up, notebook in hand, determined to debunk the snake legend. Instead, he ended up staying for hours, listening to the heartfelt stories shared by attendees. By the time he left, his skepticism had softened. "I came here looking for answers," he admitted to the daughter. "But maybe the real answer is that some things don't need explaining." The daughter herself continued to grow through the experience. What had started as a personal quest for understanding evolved into a mission to create a safe space for others. She realized that her mother's legacy wasn't confined to one person. It extended outward, touching lives in ways she couldn't have predicted. And though she missed Eleanor deeply, she took comfort in knowing that her mother's spirit lived on in every story told, every tear shed, and every connection forged. By spring, when the snow melted and the first buds appeared on the trees, the cemetery was unrecognizable. Where once there had been a simple grave surrounded by grass, there was now a vibrant patchwork of flowers, mementos, and wind chimes. Birds nested in the oak tree, their cheerful chirping mingling with the soft rustle of leaves. Visitors often commented on how alive the place felt, despite its purpose. To many, it wasn't just a cemetery anymore. It was a sanctuary, a testament to the enduring power of love. And though the snake hadn't reappeared, its presence lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. For the daughter, it remained a symbol of guidance, reminding her that sometimes the greatest mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to inspire. In its absence, she found clarity. The snake wasn't the heart of the story. Love was. And as long as people gathered to remember, to grieve, and to celebrate, that love would continue to shine brightly, lighting the way for anyone brave enough to seek it. As spring gave way to summer, Willow Creek seemed to hum with a new kind of energy. The town had always been quiet, but now there was a vibrancy in the air that hadn't existed before. It wasn't just the warmth of the sun or the longer days, it was the sense of connection. of people coming together in ways they never had before. Eleanor's grave had become more than a place to visit. It was a heartbeat at the center of the community, pulsing with stories, memories, and shared humanity. The gatherings continued every Saturday, drawing larger crowds as word spread even further. People came from all walks of life: farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, travelers passing through, and each brought their own piece of the puzzle. One weekend, a young girl stood shyly near the edge of the group, clutching a small stuffed animal in her hands. Her grandmother nudged her gently forward, whispering encouragement. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. "This is Mr. Whiskers," she said, holding up the toy. "My dad used to tuck him into bed with me when I was scared. He promised he'd always protect me." The crowd fell silent, moved by the simplicity and depth of her words. Someone handed her a tissue, while another person knelt down to give her a hug. By the time she returned to her grandmother's side, her cheeks were dry and she wore a tentative smile. These moments weren't planned or scripted. They happened organically, born out of vulnerability and trust. For many, speaking about their losses was the hardest thing they'd ever done. But once they took that first step, something remarkable occurred. They realized they weren't alone. Grief, which so often felt isolating, became a bridge connecting them to others. A middle-aged man who had lost his wife to illness found himself sitting beside a teenager whose best friend had died in an accident. Though decades apart in age, they discovered they understood each other perfectly. They exchanged numbers after the gathering, promising to keep in touch. Even those who didn't share their stories openly found solace in being present. Some sat quietly under the oak tree, listening to the wind chimes and watching the wildflowers sway in the breeze. Others walked slowly around the cemetery, pausing to read the inscriptions on nearby headstones. Each person found their own way to connect, whether through words, actions, or simply by being there. For the daughter, these Saturdays became both a source of joy and responsibility. She no longer thought of herself as just Eleanor's child. She saw herself as a steward of something much bigger. Every story shared, every tear shed, reinforced the idea that love transcended boundaries. It didn't matter if someone was remembering a parent, a sibling, a spouse, or a pet. The emotions were universal. And in sharing those emotions, people healed. Not completely, perhaps, but enough to take one more step forward. One day, a stranger arrived at the gathering carrying a guitar slung over his shoulder. He introduced himself as a musician who had heard about the cemetery and felt compelled to visit. After listening to a few stories, he asked permission to play a song. Sitting cross-legged on the grass, he strummed a melody so hauntingly beautiful that it silenced the entire group. As the notes floated through the air, tears welled up in eyes across the circle. When he finished, no one spoke for a long moment. Then a woman broke the silence. "That sounded like hope," she said softly. The musician smiled. Maybe it was. Music quickly became a regular part of the gatherings. Sometimes it was the guitarist returning with new songs. Other times, attendees brought instruments of their own. One elderly man played harmonica tunes he remembered from his childhood, while a teenage boy performed a heartfelt rap dedicated to his late brother. Even those without musical talent joined in, clapping along or humming softly. The cemetery, once a place of somber reflection, now rang with laughter, applause, and the occasional burst of spontaneous singing. But not everything was easy. There were days when the weight of grief felt heavier than usual. A mother collapsed, in sobs after recounting how her son had died suddenly, leaving behind a lifetime of dreams unfulfilled. An older man stormed off mid-story, unable to finish recounting the loss of his wife. On those days, the daughter reminded herself that healing wasn't linear. Some wounds ran too deep to be smoothed over in a single afternoon. But even in those raw, painful moments, there was comfort in knowing that people cared. Strangers offered hugs, held hands, or simply sat silently beside those struggling, offering presence instead of solutions. By late summer, the cemetery had become a kaleidoscope of color and sound. Wildflowers bloomed in abundance, their petals shimmering in the sunlight. Wind chimes tinkled melodiously, and the oak tree provided shade for those seeking refuge from the heat. Visitors left offerings that reflected their personalities: painted rocks, handwritten poems, tiny figurines, even seashells collected from distant beaches. Each item added another layer to the evolving tapestry of memories, turning the space into a living work of art. Yet, despite all the changes, some things remained constant. The daughter still visited regularly, bringing fresh flowers and tidying up the area around the grave. She talked to her mother sometimes, sharing updates about the gatherings and thanking her for inspiring such a profound transformation. Though she missed Eleanor desperately, she felt closer to her than ever before, not because of the snake or the strange occurrences, but because of the love that radiated from every corner of the cemetery. And then, one crisp autumn morning, something unexpected happened. As the daughter approached the grave, she noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned, and there it was. The black snake, sleek and familiar, coiled peacefully near the base of the headstone. It didn't move toward her or make a sound. It simply rested there as if content to bask in the early light. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "Thank you." Whether it was truly the same snake or just a symbol of her mother's enduring presence, she couldn't say. What mattered was the message it carried. Love never leaves, it only transforms. The appearance of the snake that autumn morning felt like a full-circle moment for the daughter. It wasn't just about seeing the creature again. It was as if everything she'd been through over the past year had led her to this point. The fear, the confusion, the grief, and finally the understanding. All of it came rushing back in a wave of emotions. She knelt by the grave, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out, not to touch the snake, but to acknowledge its presence. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, as quietly as it had appeared, the snake slithered away, disappearing into the grass. When she told the others at the next gathering, there was a mix of reactions. Some nodded knowingly, as if they'd always suspected the snake would return. Others listened with wide eyes, marveling at the story's latest twist. But one thing united them all: the sense that something extraordinary was happening here. Whether it was divine intervention, a spiritual message, or simply the power of nature connecting with humanity, no one could deny the impact it had on their lives. As the months passed, the gatherings continued to grow, drawing people from farther and farther away. Tour buses began stopping at the edge of town, curious travelers eager to see the cemetery that had become known as the place where love lives. Local businesses benefited too. Hotels filled up, restaurants saw an influx of customers, and even the flower shop struggled to keep up with demand. But despite the attention, the heart of the gatherings remained unchanged. This wasn't about spectacle, it was about connection. And everyone who stepped foot in the cemetery understood that. One visitor stood out among the rest, a woman in her 60s who arrived one Saturday clutching a worn leather journal. Her hair was streaked with gray, and her face bore the lines of someone who had lived a hard life. When it was her turn to speak, she hesitated, glancing around at the circle of faces. "I don't know where to start," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The daughter encouraged her gently, reminding her there was no right or wrong way to share her story. Slowly, haltingly, the woman began. She spoke of losing her son decades ago, when he was just a teenager. His death had shattered her, leaving her unable to move forward. For years, she carried his memory in silence, afraid to let anyone see her pain. But hearing about Eleanor's grave and the snake had stirred something inside her. She decided to come, hoping to find some kind of peace. By the time she finished speaking, tears streamed down her face, but so did a faint smile. "Thank you," she said, looking directly at the daughter. "I think I needed this more than I realized." Mothers like hers became common at the gatherings. People who had spent years bottling up their grief found themselves opening up, often for the first time. The cemetery wasn't just a place to honor the dead, it was a space to heal the living. Strangers became friends, sharing meals, exchanging phone numbers, and promising to stay in touch. A support network grew organically, one story at a time. By winter, the cemetery looked different once again. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling sound and creating a serene atmosphere. Despite the cold, people still came, bundled in coats and scarves, determined not to miss the gatherings. They brought lanterns to light the area, turning the cemetery into a glowing haven against the darkening sky. One man played guitar, his fingers stiff from the chill but his spirit warm. Another woman recited poetry she'd written about her late husband, her voice steady despite the frost biting at her cheeks. Even those who couldn't attend physically found ways to participate. Letters poured in from across the country, each one carrying a story of loss and love. Some sent photos, others trinkets or small tokens of remembrance. The daughter read them aloud during the gatherings, ensuring that every voice was heard, no matter how far away it came from. In doing so, she transformed the cemetery into a global sanctuary, a place where anyone could feel connected. Looking back, the daughter realized how much had changed, not just in her own life, but in the lives of everyone touched by Eleanor's story. What started as a personal journey of grief had blossomed into something far greater. Love, she understood now, wasn't confined to a single person or moment. It stretched across lifetimes, defying boundaries and uniting strangers in ways she never thought possible. And though the snake hadn't reappeared since that autumn morning, its absence didn't diminish its significance. To the daughter, it represented a bridge, a reminder that even in death, connections endure. Its fleeting presence had sparked a chain reaction, touching countless lives and proving that love has a way of finding us, no matter how lost we may feel. On the anniversary of Eleanor's passing, the entire town gathered at the cemetery. There were speeches, songs, and laughter mingled with tears. Someone released a bouquet of balloons into the sky, each one carrying a note to a loved one. Gone too soon. As the balloons drifted upward, disappearing into the clouds, the daughter felt a deep sense of peace wash over her. Her mother's legacy lived on, not in the strange events surrounding her death, but in the love she inspired in others. And the story of Eleanor Harper wasn't about a snake or a humming sound or wildflowers blooming out of season. It was about the enduring power of human connection. It reminded everyone lucky enough to witness it that while death may separate us, love keeps us tethered to each other, to memories, and to hope. And in that truth there was beauty, comfort, and endless possibility.